The observer pattern is an object-oriented solution for when you need one object to effectively watch another object. So Twitter is a really great example of this kind of publish-subscribe feeling. You follow someone on Twitter, and then Twitter will send you back updates. The observer pattern, however, is once again a response to a design problem. And that problem is that following and updating is a lot of responsibility. It meant that each of the collaborators in this publish and subscribe architecture had a lack of cohesion. So the publisher then needed to dealing with all of its followers and sending all of the updates. And the followers needed to deal with remembering to subscribe and also handling their updates on that end. So the design patterns people came up with a better object-oriented arrangement. The observer pattern abstracts all of the publishing behavior and then all of the subscribing behavior into two collaborators. So on the publishing side, we have the subject. That's the subject of the observation. So the subject has two things that it can do. It can add observers to a list, so we would have a list here, and it can notify observers on that list by calling the update method that lives inside the observer. The observer, on the other hand, just deals with updates. So it would get an update and then it would do something like display it on a screen. So this allows us to capture the abstract behavior that's involved in the observer pattern, the subject and the observer. But to concretely tie it into our own implementation, we use subclassing. So we determine which of our classes should play the role of the subject and which of our classes should play the role of the observer. In this case, we're imagining we have some class called Twitter and it subclasses the subject. And we're imagining that our client is a subclass in itself and it subclasses the observer. Now let's look at the dynamics of how the observer pattern works by using a sequence diagram. So the very first part of the pattern is that the concrete subject needs to subscribe all of its observers. So the observer itself doesn't actually have to be the one to do that subscribing. It's quite possible that there would be some other sort of godlike class or a different component that would set up the relationship between observer and subject. So I'm not going to say that the call to subscribe is coming from the observer. I'm just going to say that it comes from somewhere. So I'm just going to call this add. But what this really means is add observers. Add observers. So that just comes in and it kind of plays out and then it returns. And again, it doesn't have to come from here. The second part of the pattern is when the concrete subject is actually doing its thing. Because remember, the observer wants to be updated when anything interesting happens in the subject. So when something interesting happens, what happens is the call comes in to do the behavior of interest, whatever it is, and then that method will run. So that's just a, typical behavior that lives inside the subject. However, the subject has to have something added to it. It has to have the method call to notify observers added into that behavior of interest, because that's how the observer will hear about it. This notify observers call this implementation actually lives inside of the abstract subject. So it doesn't have to be defined here. We say that it's a self call because the concrete subject has inherited it. So this will then call update on the concrete observer. And then the concrete observer will do whatever it is that it needs to do to process the update, and then it returns, and then the behavior can continue. There are lots of ways to introduce the observer pattern into a piece of code. Let's start with a really simple version, which is when you already basically have a publisher and a subscriber and you want to set up the collaboration between them in a principled way. So in this case, we have a course and student system. So obviously, students are going to be wanting updates from the course. And here we can actually see probably that behavior of interest that I mentioned before. Whenever a lecture is published, the student is going to want to know about it. So to bring in the observer pattern, what we do is first we set up our subject class and our observer class. So we would introduce those two classes in this arrangement into our system. Then we would figure out which of our classes should extend which of these classes. So here, We have the course extending subject because the course is a subject, and we have the student extending the observer because a student is an observer, specifically of a course. Then we would set up the relationship between the subject and the observer. So we put a list inside the subject that contains the observers. Next, we would work out exactly where inside of the whole system the observers are registered with the subject. In this case, we can just say that whenever a course is launched that it gets a list of a list of students. So here we would say add observers right inside of the constructor. Again, this is highly situation dependent, so you'll want to look at your own implementation and decide where the right spot is for registration. Next, we want to figure out what the behavior of interest is going to be. In this case, we have our publish lecture behavior, which is when we want our students to be updated. So we would put our call to notify right inside of here. And then we have to override this update behavior so that when the students are notified, when that notify observers calls the update method, the student does something with it, like starts to study or reads the slides or something like that. So here we put our update code. And that's it. Then you've implemented the observer pattern.
Okay, so we've set up our class hierarchy. We've got instructors, we've got courses, and we've got people who are registered. And now we're going to print out all the registrants in that one course. And now I'm going to prepare a module called the observer pattern. So let's run it and see what happens. Great, so it's pretty minimal output here. We have Erica and James both registered, and Elisa is prepping the observer pattern. Wonderful. So now, however, we want to actually code the observer pattern because we want people to be able to enroll in this course and then be updated when I prepare a new module. And right now, they would presumably just have to check the website a whole bunch, and we want them to be notified. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to do is set up a new package called Observer to hold all of our observer stuff. And then we have an interface called the Lecture Observer. Next, we have a class called the Subject. And the Subject class, which is just a regular Java class, has a list of lecture observers. And we could have called these lecture observers students instead. This is just a design choice. But since we don't actually know that students is the only thing that will be doing the observing, then we want this to work for any observer. So we're going to keep it a little bit more generic. So now let's get our hierarchy set up. We want our course to extend subject because it's the subject of the observation. And then we want student to implement the lecture observer. And it already implements Teachable, but it's fine if it implements both of these interfaces. Great, so now let's implement some methods. So if we go into the subject, the first thing we know we need to implement is the add observer method. And it takes a lecture observer or any of its subtypes as a parameter. And then we add that parameter to the observers list. And first, of course, we check to make sure the lecture observer is not already in the list. Great. So now we need to decide where we're going to call this add observer method. Okay, well, here's the method register student, and it calls this add students method. So let's go in here, and this is the method that's adding the student to the course, which seems like a really natural place to add them as an observer. So we'll call add observer, and we pass the student in as the observer. And this all works because since course extends subject, it's inherited this add observer method. Next, we want to figure out when our observers will get notified of things. First of all, let's provide our notification code. Inside the subject, we'll say public void notify observers. We could have called it anything actually, but this is the traditional name for that method. And now we'll put in what they will be notified with. What message will they actually get? Well, they're going to get notifications about lecture modules, so we're just going to push that out to them. So this method will take a lecture module, and then for each of our observers, we're going to call this update method, which we haven't made yet, and we'll pass in that lecture module, because that's what we're sending through to the observer. So now we need to make this observer.update method, and we can declare that method up here in the lecture observer interface. But then we'll have to implement it, obviously, in the concrete classes. We could do it in student, or we could do it in each of the subclasses of student, but somebody has to implement it. So let's go into student and implement a generic version. And then in the subclasses, if we want, we can override that behavior to be something less generic. So we'll add in our update method right here with its lecture module parameter. Then for now, we'll just have it print out something that says like, prof has posted lecture module, and then the lecture module details. And since we kind of want lecture module to print out nicely, we've overridden the toString method. Great, so let's run our code and see what we get. No change. We're not getting any updates. Why not? Oh, because we're never actually calling our notify observers method. That's kind of important. We want to call notify observers when we're prepping a module. So if we look in prepare module, it calls add lecture module on the course. And the course is our subject. So right inside add lecture module, we want to call notify observers passing in the lecture module. Great. Now if we run it, it should work. And it does. Prof has posted the lecture module. And of course, we could go and improve our toString method to add some nice line breaks or some formatting so that it prints out even more nicely. Beautiful. Now we can see that every time the professor posts a module, each student is notified. So this is printing out twice because 2 students are registered.